People like you don't belong here. Edward Collins's hand strikes Dorothy Richardson in the airport lounge with the quiet certainty of a man who has never faced consequences. The sound cuts through the room, her old suitcase tipping, as papers slide across the floor, and time seems to pause. Phones rise instinctively. Cameras blink awake. What he believes is a moment of power is already being preserved as truth. Dorothy touches her cheek and stays standing. She does not cry or look away. She lifts her eyes toward the ceiling and says softly, "You chose the wrong place." Edward straightens his tie, certain status will protect him, unaware that her son is watching, and that in this ordinary waiting room, his life has just begun to unravel. Have you ever seen arrogance collapse simply because the truth was watching? Morning settled over the economy waiting area like recycled air. Cold metallic, indifferent plastic chairs aligned in rows beneath flickering screens. Boarding announcements echoing with the dull rhythm of inevitability. Dorothy Richardson rose slowly from her seat, careful in the way people become when their bodies have learned the cost of haste. At 70, her frame was small but upright, her spine still proud despite the quiet aches she never mentioned. Her skin was deep brown, lined with years of sun and patience, and her silver hair was gathered neatly into a bun at the back of her head, disciplined, practical. She wore a faded purple sweater beneath a pale blue cardigan, clothes chosen for warmth rather than attention. Her old suitcase scratched, soft-edged, loyal, followed behind her as she guided it through the narrow aisle between seats. She did not see Edward Collins at first. She did not need to. The collision was barely a whisper of contact, the soft fabric of her suitcase brushing the polished leather of his. It was the kind of thing that happened dozens of times an hour in a crowded airport. Dorothy immediately turned instinctively, her mouth already forming an apology shaped by decades of habit. Edward Collins exploded before the word could leave her lips. He was 40 tall and sharply built, the kind of man whose posture suggested command, even in a room that owed him nothing. His light blue suit was tailored to perfection. Hugging broad shoulders and a narrow waist, his tie knotted with mechanical precision. His hair was dark, carefully styled, untouched by gray, and his jawline was clean and angular, a face accustomed to being obeyed. There was no warmth in his eyes, only calculation, and a thinly veiled impatience for inconvenience. But he did not look at the suitcase. He looked at her skin. "Watch where you're going." He snapped, his voice loud enough to draw eyes sharp enough to cut. Then without pause, the words spilled out, unfiltered, ugly, deliberate racial contempt, delivered with the confidence of a man who had never been publicly corrected. He spoke of people like you, of dirt, of knowing one's place. Each sentence landed heavier than the last, not because of volume, but because of certainty. Dorothy felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the old practiced stillness she had learned as a girl in a world that demanded restraint for survival. She stood very still. She did not raise her voice. She did not shrink. Edward stepped forward and shoved her shoulder. The force surprised her, and before her balance could recover, his hand struck her face. The sound cracked through the waiting area, sharp, unmistakable. Dorothy staggered back a half step, her palm rising to her cheek. The sting bloomed quickly, heat spreading beneath thinning skin. She tasted iron. Around them, conversations died mid-syllable. Coffee cups paused inches from lips. No one moved. She did not cry. She lifted her eyes not to Edward, but upward toward the ceiling, where black domes of security cameras stared back unblinking. Her voice when she spoke was quiet, steady. "You chose the wrong place," she said. Edward scoffed, mistaking her calm for weakness. He straightened his jacket, already rehearsing his version of events, already confident that money and reputation would bend reality in his favor. Across the waiting area, a man froze with a newspaper folded halfway in his hands. Paul Richardson had been seated in the corner, deliberately positioned, where he could see exits without being seen himself. He was in his early 50s, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed plainly in a dark jacket and jeans that did not advertise status. His hair was cropped short black, threaded with gray, that came not from age, but from memory. His face was angular cheekbones, sharp jaw shadowed with permanent stubble. His eyes, cool, observant gray, were eyes trained to read rooms before they turned dangerous. He had learned that habit a lifetime ago during years that had taught him silence was often more powerful than noise. When the slap landed, something inside him locked into place. He looked again closer at the woman holding her cheek, at the familiar curve of her shoulders, the way she stood straight even now, the way she refused to look down. His mother. A flicker of emotion surged, anger, sharp and immediate, but it did not escape him. Paul did not move. He did not shout. He did not rush forward. Experience had taught him that moments like this were traps for impulse. Instead, he watched. Edward continued speaking louder now, emboldened by the absence of resistance. He gestured broadly, performing outrage for an invisible audience, already shaping Dorothy into a problem that needed to be removed. Paul's gaze drifted upward, tracing the angles of the ceiling, counting cameras, noting positions. He saw phones being lifted, hands trembling as strangers began recording. He saw fear, yes, but also witnesses. Dorothy lowered herself back into her seat with careful dignity, her hands still against her face. Her breathing was slow, controlled. Inside, memories stirred old bus stations, older voices, but she pushed them aside. This was not that world anymore. She knew it. And somewhere in this building, she knew her son would know it too. Paul unfolded his phone, his thumb hovering, not yet acting. There would be time. There was always time if one waited correctly. Around them, the airport resumed its mechanical hum, unaware that something irreversible had just begun. Edward Collins believed power followed him the way shadows followed light. It had always been that way, boardrooms that quieted when he spoke, assistants who anticipated his needs, security guards who smiled too quickly. Standing in the waiting area, he straightened his jacket again, as if fabric alone could restore order. He began to talk louder, his voice polished with authority, explaining himself to no one in particular. He announced his title, named firms he worked with, hinted at political connections. His words were sharp, rehearsed, and designed to reduce Dorothy into something manageable, a disturbance, a misunderstanding, a problem that could be escorted away. He spoke of standards of civil behavior, of how spaces like this were deteriorating because people no longer knew where they belonged. Each sentence was meant to reclaim control, to remind the room who he believed he was. Edward's face, angular and clean-shaven, tightened as he scanned for validation. His eyes flicked toward the scattered onlookers, daring someone to challenge him. No one did. Silence to him was permission. What he did not understand was that silence in places like airports did not mean agreement. It meant observation. A few rows away, Sarah Mendel stood frozen beside the service desk. She was in her early 30s, tall and slightly built, with pale skin and auburn hair pulled into a low ponytail that betrayed a long shift. Her airline uniform was neat, but worn creased at the elbows from years of leaning across counters. Sarah had chosen this job for its structure, its predictability. Conflict made her uncomfortable, but rules comforted her. She watched Edward carefully, her mouth set in a thin line, fingers unconsciously gripping the edge of the desk as she processed what she had just seen. Behind her, two passengers whispered. One lifted a phone higher. Another angled their screen for a clearer shot. Edward noticed none of it. He was too busy performing. Dorothy sat quietly, her hands folded now, her breathing steady. The sting on her cheek pulsed, but she had lived with worse pain than this. Her stillness unsettled Edward more than shouting ever could. He wanted reaction. He wanted fear. Instead, he received composure. Paul remained where he was, newspaper folded, body relaxed in a way that masked alertness. To anyone else, he looked like a man trying not to get involved. To those who knew him, those who had served beside him years ago, this was the posture of restraint before action. His mind worked methodically, cataloging behavior tone sequence. He noted how Edward framed his narrative, how quickly he shifted blame, how instinctively he reached for status as a shield. Edward's confidence grew with each passing second. He gestured broadly now, palms open as if offering reason to the room. He laughed once sharply, dismissively. "People are too sensitive," he said. "You can't say anything anymore." The phrase landed with a practiced familiarity, the kind used often by men who had never been told no. Sarah finally stepped forward. Her voice was polite, trained firm in the way customer service demanded. She asked Edward to lower his voice. She suggested they move the conversation to the desk. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes were steady. Edward turned on her, surprised. For a brief moment, irritation flashed across his face. Someone beneath his notice had spoken. He leaned in slightly close enough to invade space without touching. "Do you know who I am?" he asked quietly, dangerously calm. Sarah swallowed, but she did not step back. She had learned that retreat invited pursuit. "Sir," she replied, "I need you to calm down." The word "sir" only fueled him. He smiled, thinly nodding, as if amused, and raised his voice again, ensuring the cameras caught everything. He accused, he rationalized, he explained. Paul watched Edward's mouth move and thought of all the men he had seen like this, men who mistook volume for authority, intimidation for strength. Men who had never needed to consider consequences because someone else always cleaned up afterward. But systems, Paul knew, did not care about reputation. Dorothy shifted slightly in her seat and met Sarah's eyes. There was gratitude there, quiet and unspoken. She did not say a word. She did not need to. Years had taught her when speech was wasted. Edward's monologue began to fracture as murmurs grew louder. Phones were no longer hidden. They were visible now, undeniable. His reflection stared back at him from a darkened screen, animated, aggressive, unflattering. For the first time, uncertainty crept in. He adjusted his tie again, more sharply this time. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, stepping back. "I'll be speaking to management." Paul finally moved not toward Edward, but toward the exit line of sight. He pulled his phone out, unlocked it, and typed nothing. He did not need to. Everything that mattered was already being recorded. Edward did not see him. He was still convinced the room belonged to him. It didn't. The illusion of command held for only a few seconds longer, suspended in fluorescent light and quiet judgment, before reality began to press in from all sides. The shift was subtle, at first almost imperceptible, like pressure changing before a storm. Screens tilted, hands steadied. What had been a room full of passive witnesses became a room full of lenses, and the airport, designed to move people efficiently from one place to another, began to preserve a moment instead. Footage surfaced in fragments before it felt whole. The security cameras overhead had already captured everything with clinical indifference: the approach, the shove, the slap. Their angle was high and unflattering, reducing everyone to motion and sequence. At the service desk, a fixed camera recorded sound as clearly as image, catching Edward's voice, rising each word, clean and unmistakable. Phones filled the gaps between official angles, closer, shakier, human. No single clip told the entire story, but together they formed something complete, unarguable. Edward sensed the change before he understood it. His voice faltered mid-sentence, confidence thinning as he noticed himself reflected in black glass and glowing screens. He turned slowly, eyes darting from face to face, trying to locate an ally. There were none, only watchers. He adjusted his posture, then his tone. The anger receded, replaced by performance. He laughed too lightly and raised his hands in a gesture meant to signal reason. He claimed misunderstanding. He said the woman had provoked him, stepped into his space, twisted his words. He framed himself as the patient party pushed too far. The narrative shifted quickly, desperately, but the images did not follow. A man near the window, middle-aged, round-faced, wearing a gray hoodie, lowered his phone just long enough to meet Edward's eyes. There was no accusation in his expression, only resolve. He raised the phone again. Sarah Mendel stood rigid behind the service desk, shoulders squared, jaw tight. The longer she watched the footage replay silently on nearby screens, the steadier she felt. She had always believed rules mattered most when emotions were loud. Her pale fingers hovered over the desk terminal, logging timestamps, marking incident codes. Her voice, when she spoke to security over the internal line, was calm and precise. She described what happened without embellishment, trusting the cameras to do the rest. Dorothy remained seated, her composure unchanged. The swelling on her cheek had deepened to a muted purple, but her hands rested quietly in her lap. Years ago, she had learned that outrage burned energy better spent elsewhere. She did not look at the screens. She did not need to. She knew what they showed. What mattered was not the recording itself, but who would see it next. Paul stepped closer now, not into the center of attention, but to a vantage point where the angles aligned. He watched the footage as it appeared on a nearby monitor, paused, replayed, zoomed. The image was clear, the sound cleaner than he expected. He felt no satisfaction, no relief, only confirmation. He unlocked his phone and typed a single message. Not instructions, not urgency, just information. Years in federal advisory roles had taught him that the most effective action often looked like nothing at all. Systems moved fastest when fed clean input. Edward's attempt at control collapsed further as security personnel approached, not aggressively but firmly. One of them, Marcus Hale, was tall and thick-set. His uniform stretched across broad shoulders, earned through years of standing between conflict and consequence. His beard was trimmed close, salt and pepper, his expression unreadable. He had once been younger and quicker to judge, but a decade in public security had carved patience into him. He listened first. He always did. Marcus asked Edward to step aside. Edward protested. Marcus did not argue. He simply repeated the request slower, this time, eyes never leaving Edward's face. The cameras caught that too. Around them, murmurs spread. A woman with dark curls whispered to her companion. Someone exhaled sharply. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the air itself had chosen a side. Edward's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. He was too focused on the immediate threat loss of face, loss of dominance, to consider the deeper one forming quietly beyond the room. Dorothy reached for her phone, then her fingers steady. She typed a single sentence to her son, Paul. "I'm fine. You should watch." She added nothing else. She trusted him to understand what came next. Paul read the message without expression. He did not respond. He did not need to. The footage was already moving, shared through channels both official and informal. Once released images like these did not return to their source. They traveled. They accumulated context. They invited scrutiny. Edward's voice rose again, sharper, now edged with panic. He accused the cameras of bias, the witnesses of exaggeration. He demanded names, titles, explanations. Each demand sounded thinner than the last. The cameras did not react, they never did. By the time security guided Edward toward a quieter area, the story had already detached itself from him. It belonged to the record now stitched together from angles he could not control. Paul slipped his phone back into his pocket. His work for the moment was done. Not finished, but begun. In the waiting area, boarding announcements resumed, indifferent and rhythmic. People gathered their belongings. Planes would still depart. Lives would continue. But the cameras had captured something that would not fade with movement. They never slept. Paul Richardson did not step forward as a furious son demanding answers. He moved the way he always had, quietly, deliberately, as if the most important work required no audience. In his early 50s, Paul carried himself with a restrained strength shaped by years of disciplined service. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, his frame compact rather than bulky, built for endurance instead of display. His hair was cropped short, black, streaked with gray, earned not from age but from memory, and his face was defined by sharp cheekbones and a jaw shadowed with permanent stubble. His eyes, a muted gray, held the kind of calm that unsettled people more than anger ever could. Paul had learned long ago that rage was loud but inefficient. The lesson had been carved into him during his early years in special operations, where mistakes multiplied under emotion and silence often saved lives. Later, as a federal security advisor, coordinating international logistics, he learned a different truth systems listened best when spoken to in their own language. He waited until the waiting area returned to its mechanical rhythm before acting. Boarding announcements resumed. Passengers shifted, collecting bags, pretending normalcy. Edward Collins had already been guided away, still talking, still insisting. Paul did not follow. There was no need. He found an empty seat near a charging station and opened his laptop. His movements were economical, precise. First came the preservation request, formal time-stamped, routed through channels he knew by memory. Original security footage, unedited, locked. Audio logs from the service desk archived. Metadata preserved. The process was dull, procedural, and absolutely unforgiving. Paul trusted it more than confrontation. Across the terminal, Sarah Mendel noticed him for the first time. She had finished her report and now stood with her arms crossed loosely, watching the man who had not raised his voice once yet seem to carry gravity with him. From a distance, she saw his focus, the way he typed, without hesitation. She did not know who he was, only that he did not look like someone improvising. Paul placed a second call, this one encrypted brief. He spoke little, listened more. Names were exchanged, nothing dramatic. The phrase public assault with racial aggravation entered the conversation, followed by a pause that told him everything he needed to know. A file would be opened. Quietly. He thought of his mother, then, not as the woman with the bruised cheek sitting alone, but as the woman who had raised him with rules stricter than any military code. Dorothy had taught him that dignity was not something you demanded. It was something you demonstrated until the world had no choice but to acknowledge it. He felt no guilt for not intervening physically. She would have understood. Edward, meanwhile, was beginning to sense the shift. In a private holding room, away from the crowds, he paced, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was tight now, clipped. He spoke to an assistant, then a partner, then someone higher up. Each call ended the same way, with reassurance that sounded increasingly hollow. Edward had always relied on escalation. He was discovering too late that escalation only worked when nothing had been recorded. Within hours, the ripples spread. An investor asked a cautious question framed as concern rather than accusation. A board liaison sent a neutral email requesting clarification for the record. An ethics committee calendar updated itself marked urgent. Edward's insurance provider flagged his account for reassessment, citing exposure risk. None of it was dramatic. None of it accused him outright. That was what made it terrifying. Paul closed his laptop and finally stood. He walked past his mother without stopping, only meeting her eyes for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Dorothy nodded once, barely perceptible, her mouth set in the same calm line it had held all morning. No words were exchanged. They did not need to be. A uniformed officer approached Paul briefly to confirm a detail. The man was younger, clean-shaven, his posture stiff with respect. Paul answered politely, offering exactly what was asked and nothing more. The officer thanked him and moved on, unaware he had just spoken to the architect of the next phase. Edward would later tell himself he had been unlucky, that the timing was wrong, that the room had turned against him unfairly. What he would not admit, what he could not yet see, was that his authority had always depended on distance. Distance from scrutiny, distance from consequence. Cameras collapsed that distance. So did Paul. As Paul exited the terminal, his phone vibrated once more. A confirmation message. Data secured. Case logged. He slipped the device back into his pocket and stepped into the gray light outside. The wheels were turning now. No shouting, no threats, just momentum. The conclusion arrived without ceremony, the way real outcomes often do, carried not by headlines, but by notices, timestamps, and signatures that did not tremble. A determination was issued, precise in language and narrow in scope. Edward Collins was found responsible for public assault aggravated by racial harassment. The phrasing was clinical, almost cold. It named actions, not intentions. It did not speculate. It did not soften. Edward read the notice twice, then a third time, searching for ambiguity that was not there. In a glass-walled office, he no longer controlled his reflection, looked thinner, the angles of his face sharper under fluorescent light. The jaw that once set rooms in motion now tightened in silence. He had always believed authority was a posture you assumed and others accepted. What he was learning painfully was that authority dissolved when examined closely enough. His firm suspended him pending review. Management rights were revoked. Access was restricted. Compliance schedules populated his calendar with meetings he could not cancel. An insurer requested additional documentation, politely, urgently. None of it accused him of being a bad man. All of it treated him as a risk. There was no villain speech, no last attempt at dominance. Edward made calls that went unanswered, then calls that ended quickly. He blamed timing optics, a culture he claimed had shifted overnight. He did not blame himself. He did not have to. The system was uninterested in confession. Back at the airport, the waiting room returned to its familiar choreography. Chairs filled and emptied. Boarding groups were called. Coffee cooled and was replaced. The space had not changed. The rules had not changed. Only the distribution of consequence had. Sarah Mendel observed the room from her station posture, looser than it had been all morning. Her auburn hair had escaped its tie and brushed her collar, a small rebellion after hours of restraint. She was tall and slim, her pale skin freckled lightly across the bridge of her nose, and there was a steadiness in her eyes now that had not been there before. Sarah had replayed the moment she stepped forward a dozen times, wondering if she would do it again. The answer, she realized, was yes, without hesitation. She logged the final note in the incident file, closed it, and felt something settle into place. Rules, she understood, were not shields. They were tools. Used correctly, they worked. Dorothy Richardson rose when her boarding group was called. The bruise on her cheek had darkened a quiet bloom beneath skin that had weathered decades. She adjusted her cardigan, straightened her shoulders, and reached for her old suitcase. It rolled behind her obediently, the wheels humming over tile. She did not look for Edward. She did not need to. Her gaze was forward, her pace measured her back straight. Dignity, she had learned, was a practice. As she passed the service desk, Sarah met her eyes. There was a nod, mutual, respectful brief. No thanks were spoken. They would have been unnecessary, maybe even wrong. Dorothy had never believed gratitude was owed for decency. Paul stood apart from the flow of passengers, a fixed point at the edge of motion. He had changed nothing about his appearance, the plain jacket, the jeans, the calm that made him easy to overlook. His gray eyes tracked the room without urgency. The work was done. Not finished, never finished, but complete in the way a handoff is complete. He had given the system clean input and stepped back. It had responded exactly as designed. A younger man paused near him, a fellow traveler with a soft voice and uncertain posture, and asked if everything was okay. Paul answered simply, kindly, "It will be." He believed it. Not because outcomes were always just, but because process had held this time. Dorothy reached the gate, turned once, and caught Paul's eye from across the room. The look they exchanged was small and contained, shaped by a lifetime of shared understanding. He did not approach. She did not beckon. They did not need proximity to feel aligned. She smiled, just barely, and then joined the line. The final notices moved outward from the airport like ripples, a regulatory memo here, a board update there. Edward's name became a case study, cited carefully, then less carefully. The waiting room did not know this. It did not care. It was not designed to. Its function was continuity. Paul watched Dorothy disappear down the jet bridge and felt the familiar quiet that followed decisive action. No triumph, no relief, just alignment. He turned toward the exit, the gray light outside flattening the world into clean lines. His phone vibrated once, then went still. There would be follow-ups, hearings, confirmations. He would attend them as required. He would speak only when asked. Inside, a new boarding announcement echoed. Chairs scraped. Life moved. The waiting room remained the same. Power, however, had changed hands, not seized, not shouted into submission, but reassigned by attention, evidence, and time. Sometimes the miracle is not thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes it is quieter than that. It is a room full of people choosing not to look away. It is truth recorded when lies expect darkness. It is restraint when anger would feel easier. The Bible says the truth will set you free. Not because truth is loud, but because it endures. Dorothy did not raise her voice. Paul did not raise his hand. And yet justice still arrived, because God does not always stop the slap, but he never misses the record. In our daily lives, we may not face a moment this dramatic, but we all face choices that reveal who we are. Do we speak with dignity? Do we act with restraint? Do we trust that even when no one seems to be watching, someone always is? If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it. Someone out there may need the reminder that dignity still matters, that truth still matters, that God is still working even quietly. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, or share a moment when you saw justice unfold in an unexpected way. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing them together. And may God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps. May He watch over you and your loved ones. And may you never forget, even in the waiting rooms of life, miracles are still happening.